Morning again, brethren. We're going to move on in our studies of Philippians to look at a little cameo portrait that the Apostle Paul gives us of his fellow worker and his son in the faith, Timothy. Paul was concerned about what was happening in the church in Philippi, and he had decided that whilst he himself couldn't go to Philippi because he was in prison at this particular time in Rome, he was going to send someone from the church in Rome who was there with him to Philippi to see how things were going. And in that context, he tells us about Timothy and why he was going to send Timothy. I'm not much into the world of art. I appreciate going into art galleries and looking at paintings, but I'm certainly not in any way an expert in that particular field. But they tell me that in the world of art, that the choice of the background against which a portrait is set is very important. The painting of the portrait itself is important, but the background can serve to highlight certain aspects of the painting which one might not have perhaps noticed had the portrait been painted by a different setting or being painted in a different setting. But there's no doubt that the backdrop against which this cameo portrait of Timothy is set certainly serves to highlight the beauty of this spiritual portrait of this godly man, Timothy. The reason for that, as we will see, is because the background is such a spiritual contrast to everything that Timothy is as a Christian. He also tells us, Paul, in painting this cameo, as it were, of Timothy, he tells us what many other Christians in Rome were like at that particular time. And it's a really sad picture that Paul paints here. See what he says in verses 20 and 21. He says, I have no one else like him, that is, like Timothy, no one else like him. He goes on, he says, who takes a genuine interest in your welfare, for everyone looks out for his own interests, not the interests of Jesus Christ. And basically, what was happening was that Paul was looking around him in Rome and he was considering who he might send on this important journey to take up this task of going to Philippi and seeing how things were within the church and reporting back to Paul. And as he looked around potential candidates to ask to undertake this particular task, he found the majority of the Christians in Rome were so wrapped up in their own wee personal world and so set on pursuing their own goals and doing their own thing that they had neither interest in nor desire to undertake the task that Paul had in view. There was no way that most of these Christians in Rome were going to volunteer to undertake such a trip. Probably Paul knew that their attitude would be, that's asking too much of me. True, the journey to Philippi would take several weeks. Yes, it would be demanding. It would necessitate for the person undertaking the trip personal sacrifices, like having to leave their family, their friends, the comfort and security of home. Perhaps they would have to put on hold personal plans and projects that they were engaged in or that they had hoped to start upon. Not only that, as well as that, people weren't prepared to make personal sacrifices. Some of them may well have been willing to serve the Lord in the local church, so long as it didn't impinge upon their own plans, and so long as it didn't mean that it would be too demanding on them and they wouldn't have to make personal sacrifices. But the idea of heading off to Philippi on an important errand for the work of the kingdom, well, no, that was just too much. Paul says everyone is looking out for their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. Perhaps Paul had thought of particular individuals and thought, well, I wonder would he go? And then as he thought about that person and what he knew of that person, he realised, well, no, he probably wouldn't go. He's too wrapped up in his own affairs. And probably Paul knew that people would use all kinds of excuses. Well, Paul, I'd love to go, but it's not a good time for me at the minute. I have a lot on in work. I'm very busy. There's a lot going on in the family. I couldn't possibly go to Philippi. Everyone is looking out for his own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. Now, Paul wasn't saying, of course, that people weren't taking interest in their family and in their business and in their jobs and so on. But I think what Paul is getting across here is that people were putting these things above the things of the kingdom of God. That God, if you like, was put into second place, or maybe even further down the pecking order. Whenever Jesus said to his disciples in Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you, Jesus was establishing a principle that the believers in Rome had evidently forgotten, or they were simply choosing to ignore. And the principle that Jesus had in view is that in the outlook of life from a Christian perspective, God, the Lord, is to have priority in our thinking, in our affections, in our desires, and in the way we live our lives. Giving God priority of place in all things. So Paul was probably greatly disappointed and greatly saddened. I suppose what's even more sad is that today that attitude still prevails. Everyone seeks their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. Sometimes when you ask for particular tasks to be undertaken in the church and for people to be willing to volunteer to undertake those tasks, well, no one comes forward. Too busy, too much on, don't want to have to stop doing this. And the reality is they're not interested as they should be in the work of the kingdom. Brethren, beware of that. Paul paints this background before he paints the portrait of Timothy. And the background's very dark. Everyone is looking out for their own things, not those of Jesus Christ. Timothy, I've nobody like him. He has a genuine interest in your welfare. And it was because of that that Paul sent this man on this important task to serve the Lord. May God write upon our hearts the lessons that come from this today. God willing, tomorrow, having looked today at the background of the portrait, we'll actually move on to look at the portrait Paul draws of Timothy himself. Every blessing for today, folks.